At this very moment, a 3-6-hour countdown is quietly proceeding for 170,000 American citizens, yet most of the nation remains unaware. A colossal storm system, Super Typhoon Sinlaku, has locked onto Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands with winds of 184 miles per hour, establishing it as the most powerful storm on Earth in the year 2026. The National Weather Service recently issued a severity classification so exceptionally rare that our own team initially questioned if it was a data anomaly. It was not. The last time a storm of this magnitude devastated this same US territory was in 2018. It resulted in 3 fatalities, over $600 million in damages, and a recovery that stretched on for years. Sinlaku is already stronger, and before this exploration is complete, it will become clear why the sheer velocity of the wind is perhaps the least of the concerns with what is approaching. To follow this story as it unfolds, we invite you to join our community on Calm Space, as this narrative is only just beginning. We are interested in your reflections, where you are watching from in the world, and your thoughts on this situation. With 170,000 Americans in the path of the planet's strongest storm, and an alert so severe it was nearly mistaken for an error, we must ask, will this event receive the gravity it demands? Or will Sinlaku become another unseen catastrophe, forgotten as soon as the winds subside? There is a storm churning above the Western Pacific that many Americans will likely not hear about until after it has passed. Super Typhoon Sinlaku has intensified to 184 miles per hour, making it the most formidable storm of 2026. In approximately 36 hours, it is forecast to make landfall directly on United States soil. Not near the US, not in the vicinity of an ally, but on sovereign American territory where its citizens reside. It is a fact that deserves a moment of pause, because the silence surrounding this event is nearly as striking as the storm itself. While the mainstream news cycle focuses elsewhere, 170,000 Americans are facing a countdown to a catastrophic Category 5 typhoon, and the country at large has barely registered the threat. We will delve into the reasons for this, but first, it is essential to understand the meteorological reality. The science alone is enough to be profoundly sobering. The National Weather Service has issued what it terms an extreme severity alert for this typhoon. While such a phrase might sound like standard procedure, it is anything but. An analysis of the raw data reveals that out of 302 active weather alerts currently in effect across the United States and its territories, only 2 have been elevated to this extreme level. This storm is one of them. This classification means that the very people whose profession is to measure and communicate atmospheric danger have assessed Sinlaku and have resorted to a category they almost never employ. It is a clear signal that this is far beyond a typical severe weather event. Currently, typhoon warnings are active for both Guam and Rota, while tropical storm warnings have been issued for Tinian and Saipan. The projected path of this immense system shows its center threading directly between the islands of Rota and Saipan. This trajectory means that the eye wall, the absolute core of the storm's most destructive power, could pass directly over, or perilously close to, populated American islands. This is not a scenario of a glancing blow. It is a forecast for a direct and devastating engagement. Guam itself is home to a population of roughly 154,000 people. When combined with the Northern Mariana Islands, the total number of US citizens at risk is between 170,000 and 200,000. These are not tourists or temporary residents. They are individuals born under the American flag, who contribute to American systems and hold American passports. They are now being advised by the National Weather Service to brace for conditions capable of destroying reinforced concrete structures. The language from forecasters is not softened or hedged. Official alerts contain words like catastrophic, unsurvivable, and life-threatening, the same terminology that would trigger wall-to-wall media coverage and a massive federal response if it appeared in a bulletin for Florida or Texas. Here, however, it appears in warnings that most of the country will never see, raising difficult questions about how we perceive risk across our own nation. This is not merely a forecast, it is a countdown, and the clock is ticking. While 36 hours may sound like a considerable amount of time, it is not, especially for an island community. For a population with restricted evacuation options, aging infrastructure, and a supply chain wholly dependent on ports and airports that are about to become inoperable, that window is closing with alarming speed. The storm is indifferent to whether the mainland is paying attention or not. The time for meaningful action is rapidly diminishing. What makes this moment so genuinely alarming is not just the storm's current intensity. It is the convergence of what Sinlaku already is, what it could still become, and the vulnerable region it is about to strike. The most critical thing to understand about the next 36 hours is that this typhoon may not have finished strengthening. The atmospheric environment it is traversing is among the most favorable for rapid intensification that meteorologists have recorded in the Western Pacific this early in a season. We will examine what this means, looking at the storm's track, its structure, and the physics that cause small path deviations to yield enormous differences in outcome. For now, hold the number 184 miles per hour in your mind. The question that should trouble forecasters tonight is whether that figure represents the storm's peak or simply a waypoint on its path to something even more powerful. The projected track of Sinlaku is threading a perilous needle, creating a scenario that storm forecasters deeply dread. The storm's center is anticipated to pass between Rota and Saipan, two islands separated by only about 40 miles of open ocean. While that gap may seem wide, a Category 5 typhoon is not a single point on a map. It is a vast, rotating machine hundreds of miles across. A slight deviation of just 40 miles to the north versus 40 miles to the south could determine the difference between survivable damage and total ruin for each of those islands. This highlights a critical aspect of forecast cones that is often misunderstood, even by seasoned weather observers. The cone of uncertainty does not illustrate the size of the storm itself. Instead, it shows the probable path of the storm's center. The destructive elements, the immense wind field, the torrential rain bands, and the life-threatening storm surge all extend far beyond the cone's narrow edges, impacting a much larger area. This storm is a vast engine of nature, and its reach is far greater than a simple line on a chart. When meteorologists plot a storm's trajectory to pass between 2 points, such as Rota and Saipan, it is a common misunderstanding to think this means the islands will only be grazed by its outer edges. The reality is far more perilous. What this trajectory actually indicates is that the very center of the storm, with its most destructive forces, could pass directly overhead. At present, Sinlaku is advancing at a mere 11 kilometers per hour. This speed is deceptively, and therefore dangerously, slow. A fast-moving storm delivers a powerful but brief blow, concentrating its damage within a short window of time. A storm moving at this pace, however, does not simply pass, it lingers. The most violent winds don't just sweep across the landscape, they relentlessly grind away at it. This extended duration of exposure is a critical factor. A structure that might withstand a 4-hour assault from Category 5 conditions could easily fail after 12 hours of the same sustained pressure. Roofs that initially hold firm begin to buckle as material fatigue sets in under the relentless pressure. This slow passage also allows for immense rainfall, giving the storm's bands more time to completely saturate the ground, which in turn leads to severe flooding that compounds every other hazard. Beyond the storm's slow pace, another crucial factor is a fundamental asymmetry in its structure. Typhoons in the Western Pacific, much like their Atlantic hurricane counterparts, are not perfectly balanced systems. The right side of the storm, when viewed relative to its forward motion, is consistently the more hazardous region. This is because the storm's own rotational winds are compounded by its forward velocity, creating significantly higher maximum gusts. This same quadrant is also where the storm surge, the rise in sea level pushed ashore by the storm, is most dramatically amplified. It is a detail that profoundly changes the map of risk. Concerningly for the residents, the current forecast places several of the Mariana Islands' most populated centers directly within this dangerous high-side window. Ahead of the storm, wave heights in the open ocean are already forecast to reach 30 to 36 feet. It is a truly staggering figure that requires a moment to fully process its implications. Waves of 36 feet can temporarily render a coastline unrecognizable. This is the kind of surge that does more than just flood low-lying areas. It propels water with enough force to structurally compromise buildings that are otherwise standing strong. It is absolutely vital to understand that a storm surge is not the same thing as ordinary flooding. It is, in essence, the ocean temporarily moving onto land, and it does so with immense weight and velocity. Consider that a single cubic meter of seawater weighs just over 1,000 kilograms. This mass does not trickle in. It arrives as a devastating wall of water. Then there is the rainfall. Current meteorological projections indicate that Guam and Rota could see 15 to 20 inches of rain as the storm makes its closest approach. To place this amount into perspective, New York City receives an average of about 46 inches of rain over an entire year. In other words, these islands are facing the prospect of receiving nearly half of New York's annual rainfall in the short span of roughly 24 hours. This deluge will fall upon terrain that is, in many places, steep, with areas deforested from previous storms and underlain by soil already saturated by seasonal weather patterns. The water will have nowhere to absorb, forcing it to rush downhill with incredible speed and destructive potential. The true danger of a storm like this is exceptionally difficult to convey with a single number like wind speed, precisely because it is the compound effect of all these hazards occurring at once. Winds of 184 miles per hour will tear structures apart and flatten trees. But that same storm will also be pushing a 12 to 1 8-foot surge onto the coasts while simultaneously dumping 1.5 feet of rain further inland. All of this will impact infrastructure that, in many places, has not yet been fully restored from the last major storm. While each of these individual threats might be survivable with adequate preparation, their combined arrival over a geographic area with limited capacity for emergency response constitutes an entirely different category of crisis. This brings us to what meteorologists are observing with the greatest concern right now: Sinlaku's forward speed. Should the storm slow down even further as it nears the islands, a very real possibility, every single one of those dangerous figures will inevitably worsen. A slower storm means more time for the surge to build, more time for rain to accumulate, and more time for winds to batter structures. A storm that is already of historic intensity could become something the Mariana Islands have not witnessed in a generation. The greatest danger may not be the peak wind gust, but the sheer amount of time the storm is allowed to stay. Meteorologists use a precise definition for a phenomenon known as rapid intensification, a sustained increase in wind speed of at least 35 miles per hour within a 2-4 hour window. Sinlaku has already surpassed this threshold in recent days to achieve its Category 5 status. The unsettling question that forecasters are now confronting is whether it is about to do so again. Current atmospheric models place the probability of additional rapid intensification at over 50% within the next 18 to 24 hours. That is by no means a minor possibility. It is effectively a coin flip on whether a storm already producing 1.84 mile per hour winds will become significantly more powerful just before it makes landfall. When one understands the ocean environment Sinlaku is currently traversing, that probability begins to feel less like a forecast and more like a direct warning. In discussions of storm intensification, sea surface temperature often receives the most attention, and for good reason. Warm water is the fuel that powers these systems. However, surface temperature alone is a limited metric for predicting a storm's ultimate potential. What is far more critical is the ocean heat content, a metric which measures the thermal energy stored not just at the surface, but deep into the upper layers of the water column. A storm passing over a shallow layer of warm water will quickly churn it up through its own wave action, bringing cooler water from below and effectively cutting off its own fuel supply. But when that layer of warm water extends deep 30, 40, or even 50 meters or more, the storm can churn the ocean relentlessly, and the surface water temperature will barely drop. The Western Pacific this April is exhibiting anomalies in its ocean heat content that are, to be perfectly blunt, highly unusual for this time of year. The warm layer is exceptionally thick. This means the fuel supply is not just a surface-level phenomenon, it extends deep into the ocean, effectively disabling the natural self-cooling mechanism that typically acts as a governor on a storm's ultimate intensity. Sinlaku is moving over what amounts to a vast reservoir of energy, and it possesses the ideal atmospheric conditions to draw upon that energy almost without restriction. The second critical element is vertical wind shear. Wind shear describes the change in wind speed and direction at different altitudes in the atmosphere, and it is the most powerful natural enemy of a tropical cyclone. When wind shear is high, it effectively tears at the top of the storm, disrupting the organized vertical structure, the stack that a hurricane or typhoon absolutely needs in order to strengthen. But when shear is low, the storm can build vertically without interference, allowing its internal engine to become more organized, efficient, and powerful. Currently, the shear values along the storm's projected path are extremely low. In essence, the atmosphere is not fighting back. When you combine these two factors, a deep, warm ocean and low wind shear, you have what forecasters call a perfectly favorable environment for a storm to reach its maximum potential. The atmospheric conditions surrounding Typhoon Sinlaku are converging to create a perfect storm for intensification, a meteorological scenario akin to dousing a fire with both fuel and oxygen while simultaneously sidelining the firefighters. This environment is not just permitting the storm to persist, it is actively feeding its explosive growth. What makes this particular event so profoundly unusual, however, is not merely its raw power, but its timing. We are in April, a month that typically falls well outside the Western Pacific's peak typhoon season, which runs from August to October. The early part of the year is normally characterized by cooler ocean waters and less stable atmospheric patterns, factors that serve as natural brakes on the kind of rapid development we are currently witnessing. Therefore, a Category 5 super typhoon, supported by such ideal environmental conditions, represents a significant statistical anomaly for this time of year. The ocean simply should not hold this much thermal energy, and the wind shear should not be this accommodating. And yet, this is the reality we face. Sinlaku's central pressure has already plummeted into a historically dangerous range. Current forecast models are now exploring scenarios that could see its pressure drop below 900 millibars prior to landfall. To put this into perspective, the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded in the Western Pacific have registered central pressures in the 870 to 900 millibar range. Every decrease in pressure signifies a massive surge in the storm's energy, which translates to more violent eyewall winds and a more robust, formidable structure. Veteran forecasters, who have dedicated their careers to analyzing these systems, are seeing pressure trends that recall the ominous signatures of past storms that went on to rewrite meteorological history. We have witnessed storms that defied their own forecasts in a matter of hours. Hurricane Patricia in 2015 exploded from a Category 1 to a Category 5 inches, just 24 hours. While Typhoon Haiyan in 2013 was still intensifying as it made landfall. These examples underscore a critical point. While the models are invaluable tools, they are not infallible prophecies. When environmental conditions are this perfect with an exceptionally warm ocean and a highly compliant atmosphere, the models have a known tendency to underestimate the ultimate potential of what is developing. For the 170,000 Americans in its path, the 3-6 hour window is rapidly closing, and the storm aimed at them may not have yet shown its final, terrifying form. To fully comprehend the gravity of this impending disaster, it is essential to first correct a common and critical misunderstanding. Guam is not some distant American protectorate, a territory in name only, or a foreign country receiving US assistance. In the most literal and legal sense, Guam is the United States of America. Its people are American citizens by birth. They carry American passports, and they serve in the US military at one of the highest per capita rates found anywhere in the nation. They live under the governance of federal law. Despite this, they are about to be hit by the most powerful storm on the planet, while receiving only a fraction of the national attention that a similar threat to any mainland state would undoubtedly command. This stark disparity in focus is a deeply troubling reality. This same framework of American identity applies equally to the Northern Mariana Islands. The Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, CNMI, became a U.S. territory in 1978, and its residents are also American citizens. The CNMI's largest island, Saipan, is home to approximately 48,000 people, which, combined with Guam's population of around 154,000, places the total number of Americans in the storm's direct path somewhere between 170,000 and 200,000. If an identical storm were bearing down on a coastal city of comparable size within the continental US, the national response would be immediate and all-encompassing, dominated by non-stop media coverage. In this case, however, even as the National Weather Service issues its most dire warnings, the mainland seems to be barely registering the impending crisis. A significant part of this disconnect stems from simple geography. Guam is located nearly 3,800 miles from Los Angeles, a location that places it geographically closer to Tokyo, Manila, and Sydney than to the continental United States. This vast physical separation inevitably fosters a psychological distance, a cognitive gap that is palpable, even if it should be entirely irrelevant when the safety of American citizens is at stake. The human mind struggles to instinctively process American territory and an island in the Pacific with the same level of urgency, even when both phrases refer to the exact same place. Another contributing factor is the region's political structure. The American citizens of Guam and the CNMI are unable to vote in presidential elections. Their representation in the House of Representatives is a non-voting delegate, and they have no senators whatsoever. As a result, the political incentive structure that normally galvanizes national attention during a disaster driven by electoral significance, media markets, and votes simply does not function here in the same manner. These are Americans with less political power than those in any state, a fact that becomes painfully apparent in the cold calculus of media coverage as a major storm bears down. It must also be understood that the region in Sinlaku's path has a profound and long-standing familiarity with typhoons. The Mariana Islands are situated directly within what meteorologists call Typhoon Alley, a corridor of exceptionally warm water in the Western Pacific, where the vast majority of the world's most intense tropical cyclones form and track. In fact, Guam has been struck by more major typhoons per decade than nearly any other populated location on the planet. Its residents know what is coming. They possess emergency plans and a deep reservoir of experience. However, experience and infrastructure are two entirely different matters, and it is the question of infrastructure that makes this situation so profoundly unsettling. The island's geographic isolation magnifies every single problem a storm can create. The complex supply chains that mainland communities take for granted, the constant convoys of trucks delivering food, water, building materials, and fuel are non-existent on an island located 3,800 miles from the nearest major port. Absolutely everything that reaches Guam or the CNMI arrives by ship or by plane. When the ports are damaged and the airport is rendered inoperable, the supply chain doesn't just slow down, it ceases to exist. Re-establishing that critical lifeline can take weeks, even under the most favorable circumstances. This leads to a stark realization. The most dangerous place to live under the American flag might not be a combat zone, but rather a beautiful tropical island that most mainlanders could not locate on a map. Now sitting in the path of a historic storm, less than 36 hours from landfall. Beyond its civilian community, Guam is also home to one of the most strategically vital military installations in the entire Pacific. The super typhoon now bearing down on the island, however, will make no distinction between a family home in the village of Dedido and a hardened aircraft hangar at Andersen Air Force Base. Situated on the island's northern tip, Andersen Air Force Base acts as a critical nerve center for all United States operations across the Pacific. It is fully equipped to support long-range B-1, B-2, and B-52 bomber missions, and serves as an essential logistics hub for projecting American military force throughout the Western Pacific region. In a geopolitical climate where rising tensions with China and North Korea have prompted the Pentagon to accelerate investments in its Pacific infrastructure, Andersen is far from a relic of a bygone era. On the contrary, it is absolutely central to current U.S. strategic planning and a fundamental cornerstone of America's defense posture in a complex and rapidly evolving world. The base on Guam is far more than a remote outpost. It serves as a critical hub for equipment, fuel, and personnel, whose operational readiness is vital to security far beyond the island's shores. When Typhoon Mawar struck in 2023, it offered a stark preview of this vulnerability. Operations at Andersen Air Force Base were severely disrupted as equipment was evacuated and infrastructure sustained damage that required weeks of repairs to restore full capacity. The approaching storm, Sinlaku, is projected to be even stronger. This grim forecast transforms a theoretical risk into an urgent and active planning problem, a scenario that defense strategists are confronting at this very moment. The arrival of such a powerful storm has, perhaps predictably, prompted speculation in some online circles regarding the possibility of engineered weather. Anytime a major atmospheric event threatens a strategic military installation, questions arise. For historical context, the United States government did run Project Storm Fury from 1962 to 1983, an attempt to weaken hurricanes by seeding them with silver iodide. However, the results were inconclusive, and the program was ultimately discontinued. The scientific consensus since then has been unambiguous. The sheer scale of energy within a storm of this magnitude lies far beyond our current ability to create, steer, or meaningfully modify. Sinlaku is the product of natural phenomena, an unusually warm Pacific, low wind shear, and shifting seasonal patterns. There is simply no credible evidence to suggest anything else. What the strategic dimension does underscore, however, is a point that runs through every aspect of this event. The vulnerability here is not confined to one sector. It is military, it is civilian, and it is infrastructural at every level. The storm, of course, is an indifferent force of nature, unaware that its path intersects with a linchpin of Pacific security. But the people responsible for that security are acutely aware. They are watching the same forecast models as everyone else, but with an understanding of stakes that are immeasurably higher. There is a sharp irony in this situation, one that defines Guam's precarious position. The very military presence that makes the island so strategically valuable shares the exact same exposure to risk as the civilian population it operates alongside. An aging power grid, vulnerable communication systems, and coastlines exposed to storm surge, these challenges do not stop at the perimeter of the base. On one small island, under one massive storm, 170,000 American citizens, and one of the most important military installations in the Pacific, are waiting for the same impact, bound by a shared fate. At this point, the narrative of the storm becomes a sobering examination of public policy and infrastructure, and the story it tells is an uncomfortable one. Guam's power grid is not a modern system. Much of the generation equipment currently in use on the island is approaching or has already surpassed 50 years of operational life. These are not systems designed with the resilience for a Category 5 hurricane in mind. They were built in a different era, to different standards, and have been patched, extended, and worked around for decades as the island's population and energy demands grew. The Guam Power Authority has acknowledged what its own internal documents describe as a critical shortfall in generation capacity. This means the grid is not just old, it is insufficient even under normal operating conditions, running on a thin margin that leaves no room for major disruptions. The consequences of this fragility were laid bare in May of 2023, when Typhoon Mawar, a Category 4 storm at landfall, knocked out power to an estimated 98% of the island. In an instant, nearly the entire population of a United States territory lost electrical service. It took weeks to restore power to most areas, and months before full restoration was achieved. And for all its destruction, Mawar was not a Category 5 storm. Sinlaku is, and it may still be intensifying. The reason this matters so profoundly is that on an island, power is not just a matter of comfort, it is a matter of survival. Power is what drives the pumps for the water distribution system. When the grid goes down, water pressure fails. Hospitals are forced onto backup generators with limited fuel. Communications infrastructure, which also relies on powered relay stations, begins to fail in sequence. The refrigeration necessary for insulin, blood supplies, and vaccines becomes a crisis within hours. This cascade of failure does not take days to begin. It starts almost immediately after the grid fails. The roads on Guam and in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands are, in many places, already in poor condition due to previous storms and deferred maintenance. Major typhoons routinely deposit enough debris, flooding, and structural damage to make significant portions of the road network impassable. This prevents emergency vehicles from reaching people who need evacuation or medical attention. Ports are closed during the storm and often damaged afterward, cutting off the resupply chain at its source. The airport, the normal conduit for essential goods and personnel, becomes unusable and frequently requires runway inspection and repair before operations can resume. In this kind of isolated environment, recovery timelines are not measured in days. After Typhoon Yutu struck the Northern Mariana Islands in 2018, some communities were without consistent power for months. Infrastructure repairs that might take weeks on the mainland can take much longer on islands, where every material, every specialized piece of equipment, and every additional technician must be shipped in from thousands of miles away. The supply chain for recovery is subject to the same geographic constraints as the supply chain for daily life. You cannot simply send a convoy of utility trucks from the next state. There is no next state. There is only the ocean. What makes Sinlaku particularly dangerous in this context is not just what it will do, but what it will do to a system that is already not whole. Guam has been hit repeatedly over the past decade, and the CNMI has not fully recovered from U2. Infrastructure that was damaged and never fully replaced now faces this storm in a weakened state. A building with a repaired but not replaced roof section is not structurally equivalent to an undamaged building. A grid that has been patched rather than rebuilt carries vulnerabilities that a new system would not. The island is not starting this event from a baseline of full capacity. It is starting from a baseline that is already compromised. A Category 5 storm is now about to stress test every single one of those compromises simultaneously. We have seen this system fail before. The true question is not whether a community will struggle in the face of a historic storm. The question is how deep the failure will penetrate, how long the darkness will last, and whether the outside world will even be watching when it happens. This is the shadow cast by Super Typhoon U2. On October 25th, 2018, this Category 5 storm made landfall on the islands of Saipan and Tinian in the northern Mariana Islands, unleashing sustained winds of 180 miles per hour. At the time, it was the most powerful storm to ever strike United States soil in recorded history. The destruction it left behind was not the kind that is simply cleaned up and forgotten. It was a scar that would be lived with for years, a trauma embedded in the landscape and the collective memory. The storm damaged or completely destroyed 6,000 homes, in a territory with a total population of roughly 50,000 people. This number is not merely a statistic. It represents a near-total collapse of the available housing. The very concept of shelter was erased for thousands. In the aftermath, families found themselves sleeping in cars, in emergency shelters, or in the precarious remains of structures deemed only partially habitable. With schools closed and the commercial sector gutted, the island's already fragile economic engine seized and stopped. This was a complete disruption of the fundamental pillars of a functioning society. The structural failures during U2 exposed a critical difference between the islands of Saipan and Tinian and their neighbor, Guam. The housing stock in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands has a much higher proportion of wood frame construction, while Guam more commonly uses reinforced concrete. Modern typhoon engineering standards demand concrete for resilience against major storms, but the enforcement of those codes and the financial ability of residents to build to them has been inconsistent across the territory. This vulnerability was brutally exploited when U2's eye wall moved over Saipan. Wood frame buildings that might have survived a lesser storm became matchsticks in the face of a Category 5 onslaught. The concrete buildings, however, largely survived. The storm drew a clear, devastating line between what was built to code and what was not. Remarkably, only 3 people died as a direct result of the storm. That figure seems impossibly small against the backdrop of such widespread ruin, and it raises a vital question: how was the death toll not higher? The answer lies in the cultural memory of the residents, who possess a generational knowledge of typhoons that mainland Americans simply do not. They understood what was coming, they sheltered appropriately, and they made life-saving choices under immense pressure. But the storm still exacted a terrible price in property, health, and long-term well-being. In the hardest-hit areas of Saipan, power outages lasted not for days or weeks, but for months, with some communities not having reliable service restored until well into 2019. In that extended darkness, a cascade of secondary impacts unfolded in real time. Water supplies were disrupted, access to medical care was limited, and economic losses compounded daily. The disaster did not end when the winds died down. It continued quietly, a slow-motion crisis, largely unnoticed by the mainland for the better part of a year. In many meaningful ways, the recovery from U2 is still incomplete. Infrastructure investments that were promised have moved slowly through the bureaucratic channels that govern disaster funding. Communities slated to be rebuilt to stronger, more resilient standards are still navigating that process. Some residents never returned, choosing to leave for Guam, Hawaii, or the mainland, rather than rebuild in a place they knew would eventually face another storm, just like the one that destroyed their homes. And now, a new storm, Sinlaku, is approaching on a track that could place its eyewall over the same geography that U2 devastated. Its winds currently exceed U2's landfall intensity, and it is bearing down on infrastructure that, in some areas, is still a patchwork of post-disaster repairs. The precedent of U2 does not just establish what is possible here. For a population that has not fully recovered, it establishes what is probable. To grasp the full extent of this vulnerability, we must look back to a different storm, often called the forgotten catastrophe, Typhoon Pongsona. On December 8, 2002, Pongsona made landfall on Guam with sustained winds of 144 miles per hour. While it was not the most powerful storm to ever hit the island, the damage it inflicted on Guam's infrastructure was so complete and so prolonged that 2 decades later, it still shapes how engineers and emergency managers think about the island's exposure to risk. Pongsona destroyed or severely damaged approximately 2,500 homes and structures. It inflicted economic damage estimated at over $700 million on an island whose entire economy is built around tourism and the military. The commercial sector was wrecked. Hotels that form the backbone of the tourism industry sat shuttered for months. And businesses, without the reserves to absorb a prolonged closure, simply never reopened. The power grid did not just falter, it failed completely. In a single moment, every resident of Guam lost electrical service. The restoration process began as soon as the winds allowed crews to work, but it still took months to bring power back to all areas. During that time, Guam ran on a limited supply of generators, and the fuel for those generators had to be shipped in under logistical conditions that were themselves compromised by storm damage to the port. Compounding this crisis was a total communication blackout. Without power, cell towers went dark, and landline infrastructure that had not been buried was destroyed. The island was functionally isolated, making the coordination of recovery assistance enormously difficult. Information moved at a crawl, and the true needs on the ground were hard to assess. When the federal response arrived, it was working with an incomplete picture, because the very systems for reporting damage had themselves been damaged. What Pongsona exposed most clearly was the feedback loop that makes island storm recovery uniquely brutal. All the tools needed to recover the cranes, the generators, the utility trucks, the fuel, the food, the building materials have to come from somewhere else. But the systems that bring things from somewhere else, the port, the airport, the roads, are the very things the storm has just damaged. This creates a devastating paradox. You cannot begin to recover until the port is cleared. But clearing the port requires heavy equipment that needs to arrive through that same obstructed port. This circular dependency is not a theoretical concept. It played out with grinding clarity after Pongsona, demonstrating the fundamental challenge of rebuilding an isolated community when it has been cut off from the world. The fundamental infrastructure of the islands, however, did not significantly improve after Typhoon Ponga. The power grid that collapsed entirely in 2002 was never truly rebuilt. Instead, it was patched, extended, and maintained. This means the generation equipment, which was already considered old 2 decades ago, is now significantly more aged. The critical vulnerability that Ponga exposed a grid incapable of surviving a major direct hit was thoroughly documented, studied, and discussed in official reports, yet the underlying weakness remained. When Typhoon Mawar struck in 2023, knocking out power to 98% of the island, it was not a new kind of failure. It was a tragic replay of the same systemic breakdown. With the core system fundamentally unchanged, Super Typhoon Sinlaku is now poised to test its fragility once more. This brings us to the concept of a compound failure cascade, a term that is not a dramatic metaphor, but a formal framework in engineering and emergency management. It describes what occurs when multiple, interconnected systems under stress begin to fail in sequence. Each failure in the chain makes the next one more probable, and its consequences more severe. This cascading effect is precisely why the real-world damage from disasters often surpasses what predictive models forecast, especially when those models assess each hazard in isolation. Sinlaku is not just one threat to the Mariana Islands. It is at least 4 arriving simultaneously. Catastrophic winds, a historic storm surge, extreme rainfall causing widespread flooding, and the prolonged duration of all 3 due to the storm's slow advance. Any one of these would be a major emergency on its own, arriving together and sustained over a long period. They interact in ways that multiply the destruction far beyond what any single threat assessment would predict. The destructive sequence often begins with the wind, which relentlessly works on structures, trees, and power lines, anything not firmly anchored. Then, the storm surge arrives, inundating coastal areas with a force that does far more than just flood. It undermines foundations, turns vehicles and debris into lethal projectiles, and injects corrosive salt water into electrical systems and buildings, causing damage that lingers long after the water has receded. Following this, the extreme rainfall saturates inland regions, destabilizing slopes and flooding roads that are now impassable due to wind-blown debris. This water fills basements and ground floors, carrying with it all the contaminants stirred up by the storm. Each phase critically impedes the response to the one before it. Crews cannot begin clearing roads while the surge is still active. Structural damage cannot be assessed in a building that is still under 2 feet of water. Power cannot be restored to a neighborhood when fallen lines are inaccessible due to flooding and debris. The cascade, then, is not just about what the storm does, but how each of its elements systematically prevents recovery from the others. Beyond the physical destruction, there is a phenomenon emergency managers call recovery fatigue. This is not a medical diagnosis, but a distinct pattern observed in communities that endure repeated major disasters. Over time, they exhibit measurable declines in key resilience indicators. This is not because people lose their will to rebuild, but because the resources required to do so, financial, physical, and psychological, are finite. After multiple claims, insurance coverage can become difficult or impossible to maintain. Personal savings used for a previous recovery have often not been replenished. The emotional reserves that bind communities together, the collective energy, and the shared belief that rebuilding is possible, begin to erode with each successive event. The CNMI experienced this after Super Typhoon Yutu in 2018 and Guam after Typhoon Mawar in 2023. Neither has fully returned to its pre-storm baseline. They are not starting this new challenge fresh, they are starting tired. This raises a sobering question. Is resilience in the Marianas diminishing over time? The honest answer appears to be that, in several meaningful ways, yes. This is not a reflection on the strength or character of the people, but a result of the brutal mathematics of repeated catastrophes on a geographically isolated island chain. Every major storm draws down the reserves, financial, infrastructural, and human, that make recovery possible. When the next storm arrives, before those reserves are fully restored, the net outcome is invariably worse than it would have been from a standing start. Sinlaku is therefore not just a strong storm hitting a vulnerable place. It is a strong storm hitting a vulnerable place that has been struck before, has not fully recovered, and is now being asked to absorb a blow that may be more powerful than anything its recent history has prepared it for. The very timing of this storm presents what could be called the April problem. For over a century, meteorologists have tracked the rhythm of the Western Pacific typhoon season. The peak occurs from August through October, when sea surface temperatures reach their yearly maximum and atmospheric conditions are most ripe for tropical cyclone development. The early months of the year, January through April, are supposed to be the quiet off-season. It is a time when the ocean is generally cool enough and the atmosphere unfavorable enough that a Category 5 super typhoon simply should not be happening. Yet, Sinlaku is a Category 5 super typhoon, and it is only April. To grasp the full significance of this, one must look at the ocean beneath it. Sea surface temperatures across the western Pacific are currently running between 1 and 2 degrees Celsius above the long-term average for this time of year. While that may sound modest, it is not. The relationship between ocean temperature and cyclone intensity is non-linear. Small increases in water temperature provide a disproportionately large amount of energy to a storm. The ocean in April is behaving in a way it shouldn't, and Sinlaku is achieving a strength it shouldn't be able to, and these two facts are directly connected. This unusual ocean warmth may be linked to the El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, which is currently in a transition phase that some forecasters describe as a drift toward El Niño conditions. El Niño years are characterized by warmer than average sea surface temperatures in the central and eastern Pacific, which causes shifts in atmospheric circulation patterns that influence wind shear across the western Pacific. The situation is complex, however. In a classic El Niño pattern, conditions in parts of the western Pacific can sometimes become less favorable for typhoon development. The fact that Sinlaku has formed so powerfully, so early, suggests that our changing climate is creating conditions that defy old patterns, presenting a new and unpredictable danger. The transitional years, when vast climate patterns like ENSO are shifting, can create unusual and sometimes extreme conditions as the planet's atmospheric and oceanic systems recalibrate. The storm known as Sinlaku may well be a product of such a recalibration. The longer-term trend, however, is far more difficult to set aside. A growing body of research published over the last decade has consistently shown that tropical cyclones around the globe are intensifying at rates between 12 and 15% faster than they did in the second half of the 20th century. This means that storms are reaching the wind speed threshold for a major hurricane or typhoon more quickly than ever before. The maximum intensity they achieve before making landfall is also increasing, and the zone where this rapid intensification can occur is expanding, both geographically and across the calendar. In simple terms, this tells us that a month like April is no longer as safe as it once was. The seasonal buffers we once relied upon, those periods when the ocean was too cool and the atmosphere too stable for extreme storms, are steadily eroding. The storm season is measurably, although not uniformly, getting longer, and Sinlaku's emergence fits perfectly within that overarching trend. If you ask a climate scientist whether a single storm can be directly attributed to climate change, they will give you an honest and direct answer. No, individual events cannot be pinned to a single cause. But this is where a more important question arises. If you ask those same scientists whether the conditions that created Sinlaku, unusually warm waters in April, exceptionally low wind shear, and a favorable atmospheric environment so early in the year are consistent with climate projections, the answer is just as clear. Yes, they are entirely consistent. What we are seeing may not be an anomaly at all. Instead, we may be looking at the establishment of a new baseline. This could be the very future that climate models have long predicted, arriving a few years ahead of schedule at 184 miles per hour, and taking aim at 170,000 American citizens who need the rest of the world to comprehend the danger they now face. While Typhoon Sinlaku was organizing itself in the western Pacific, the very ground beneath the northern Mariana Islands was stirring with its own power. It seems that in this part of the world, catastrophic threats rarely arrive one at a time. A magnitude 5 earthquake struck in the pagan region of the northern CNMI, originating from a depth of approximately 226 kilometers. Now, before the mind immediately leaps to the worst-case scenario, an understandable instinct, given the circumstances, it is vital to explain why deep earthquakes are fundamentally different from the shallow ones that typically make headlines. The tremors that cause buildings to collapse, trigger devastating tsunamis, and constitute genuine emergencies are almost always shallow events, occurring within the upper 70 kilometers of the Earth's crust. In those cases, the energy is released close to the surface, translating into violent and destructive ground motion. When an earthquake originates 226 kilometers down, its energy must travel through an immense column of rock before it can ever reach the surface. By the time it arrives, that energy has dissipated dramatically. It is therefore highly unlikely that this particular event was even strongly felt by anyone on the islands. There is no credible evidence that it triggered a tsunami, nor is there any proof that it altered the behavior of the approaching storm in any measurable way. On its own technical merits, this earthquake was merely a data point for a regional seismic catalogue, not a headline event. And yet, it is still worth understanding where it happened, and why earthquakes in this region are not a rare occurrence, but rather a permanent condition of life. The Mariana Subduction Zone is one of the most seismically active environments on the entire planet. What is happening beneath these islands is one of the most dramatic and ongoing geological processes on Earth. Here, the immense Pacific plate is being driven downward, forced to slide beneath the neighboring Philippine Sea plate. This colossal interaction has carved out the Mariana Trench, the deepest point in any ocean on Earth, plunging to nearly 36,000 feet below sea level. This geological process of subduction does not happen smoothly or quietly. It generates constant seismic activity across a vast range of depths, from shallow quakes near the surface to deep events like this one, occurring far down in the mantle, where the descending plate is subjected to unimaginable pressure and temperature changes. In this region, earthquakes are not exceptional events. They are not signals of some unusual geological unrest. Instead, they represent the constant background noise of living directly on top of one of the planet's most active tectonic boundaries. The residents of the CNMI understand this reality in the same way that people in Kansas understand the possibility of tornadoes. It is simply a fundamental and ever-present part of their environment. To live here is to accept this geological truth. Now, there is a fringe area of research worth acknowledging, because on Calm Space, we do not shy away from the edges of scientific consensus when a question is genuinely interesting. Some researchers have speculated whether deep seismic events might be able to influence atmospheric conditions through mechanisms involving ground heat flux. The essential idea is that seismic activity could release thermal energy through the crust in a way that might subtly affect surface pressure or moisture dynamics. Others have explored whether pressure waves from deep earthquakes could interact with the lower atmosphere, potentially influencing storm development or behavior. It is crucial to note that these are not mainstream hypotheses. The observational evidence to support them is weak. The proposed mechanisms are incredibly difficult to test, and the broader scientific community has not validated them. The honest framing is that the pagan earthquake and the super typhoon were two separate events, produced by two entirely different planetary systems. They operate on completely different timescales and are governed by entirely different laws of physics. And they simply happen to be occurring at the same time in the same general region. It was a coincidence of timing and proximity, not a causal chain. It is not a signal or a conspiracy, but simply the planet doing several things at once, which it does constantly, without any regard for our human sense of narrative convenience. But this is where we should pause and sit with an idea for a moment, because the coincidence, even when stripped of any causal meaning, illuminates something genuinely important about the story of what is happening to these islands. The people in the path of Sinlaku do not only face hazards that come from the sky, They live on a narrow chain of islands, suspended above one of the most geologically violent boundaries on Earth. They face typhoons from above, organized by a warming atmosphere and fueled by an increasingly energetic ocean, all while the very ground beneath their feet is in constant, powerful motion. Below the surface, seismic activity persists, driven by the ceaseless grinding of tectonic plates, a process that has shaped this region for millions of years and will continue for millions more. Above, there is volcanic activity. Several of the northern Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, pagan included, are active volcanoes. This environment of threat is not simple, it is layered, originating from multiple directions and unfolding across timescales from the deep geological past to the immediate 3-6 hour forecast. It raises a difficult question. Can one think of another American community of this size facing such a complex and simultaneous array of dangers? Imagine a community situated in the planet's most active typhoon corridor, positioned directly over one of its most active subduction zones and neighboring active volcanic systems. These islands are so profoundly isolated that the reliable supply chains and emergency support that mainland communities depend on simply cannot operate in the same way. It would be a challenge to find a parallel. Despite this, the community of 170,000 American citizens here receives only a fraction of the infrastructure funding, political focus, and national emergency preparedness that their objective level of risk would seem to demand. To be perfectly clear, the earthquake did not create the typhoon. There is no known physical mechanism through which a deep seismic event, occurring 226 kilometers underground, could generate, steer, or intensify a Category 5 tropical cyclone in the atmosphere far above. The laws of physics do not support such a connection, and the evidence does not suggest it. But the very fact that the earthquake happened at all, quietly unfolding beneath the same islands that Sinlaku was targeting, serves as a powerful reminder. It tells us that any conversation about vulnerability here cannot be limited to just the storm, the aging power grid, the fragile supply chain, the political invisibility, or the underfunded infrastructure. As vital as those issues are, the complete picture of life in the Northern Marianas must also include the unsettling reality that the ground itself is in a state of constant, subtle motion, punctuated by tremors strong enough to be detected by seismometers thousands of miles away. For most of the country, there has been little reason to consider any of this. The Mariana Trench is often just a topic in a middle school geography class, learned and then quickly forgotten. A subduction zone remains a distant abstraction. For the vast majority of Americans, the volcanic islands of the northern CNMI do not appear on their mental map of what constitutes the United States, where its borders lie, and what its citizens endure. This lack of awareness, this collective blind spot, is precisely what allows the infrastructure deficit to continue, the political distance to grow, and the gap in media coverage to feel acceptable. After all, you cannot advocate for communities you have never been prompted to think about. The planet is simply more active in this corner of the world than in almost any other. The atmosphere above, the ocean surrounding, and the earth below are all engaged in extraordinary processes, each on its own timeline. The people who have built their lives here did not select an easy place, but they are Americans. And with Sinlaku just 36 hours away and the seismograph continuing its quiet work, the question of whether America is paying attention is not merely rhetorical. It has a tangible answer, one being written at this very moment in coverage, decisions, policy responses, and the allocation of emergency resources over the next day and a half. The ground has shifted, the storm is approaching, and 170,000 people are waiting to see which version of America will arrive. While Super Typhoon Sinlaku was gathering strength in the Western Pacific to become the most powerful storm on Earth, the National Weather Service was engaged in its daily work, managing the full spectrum of atmospheric chaos across the United States and its territories. On this day, however, that scope was captured by a number that warrants a pause. There were 302 active weather alerts issued simultaneously, spanning every region of the country, across multiple seasons, and in numerous categories, all at once. Let that figure settle for a moment. 302. Wildfire warnings were in effect for parts of the southwest, where temperatures had been unusually high for weeks and humidity had fallen to levels that transformed dry vegetation into a landscape awaiting a single spark. These were not minor alerts for remote wilderness. They covered communities, infrastructure, and populated valleys. Here, the mix of heat, low humidity, and wind created conditions that fire behavior specialists describe with the same urgent language that meteorologists use for Category 5 hurricanes. At the same time, flood watches and warnings were active across the southeast. A separate storm system had stalled there, producing days of relentless rain. This slow, grinding precipitation not only floods streets, but soaks the ground until it can absorb no more, forcing water into homes and onto roads. Meanwhile, in the northern plains, blizzard conditions were snarling transportation and isolating communities with late-season winter weather, long after most residents had considered the chapter on winter closed. It's a dizzying portrait. Blizzards, wildfires, and floods all occurring within the same country during the same week. And then, sitting nearly alone at the very peak of the severity scale, was the extreme alert for Super Typhoon Sinlaku in the Pacific. Here, it is essential to understand a crucial distinction, as it is easy to oversimplify what is a genuinely complex situation. These individual events are not mechanically linked. The blizzard in the northern plains did not trigger the wildfire in the southwest, nor did the flooding in the southeast give rise to Sinlaku. Each of these weather systems has its own immediate, local cause rooted in regional atmospheric dynamics, seasonal cycles, and specific meteorological setups. A meteorologist could explain the cause and effect of every single one of those 302 alerts without ever needing to reference the others. They are, in effect, separate events, but they are not entirely disconnected. They share an underlying condition, a commonality that makes all of them more probable, more powerful, and more likely to occur at the same time than historical records would lead us to expect. While each is a distinct phenomenon, they appear to be expressions of a broader, systemic shift, hinting at a new and more volatile normal. Our planet's climate system can be thought of as a vast machine for distributing heat. It captures energy from the sun and moves it through the atmosphere and the oceans, a process that drives the weather patterns we experience from a gentle spring shower to a ferocious Category 5 typhoon. When the total energy within that system increases, as it does when global average temperatures climb, the machine doesn't simply operate at a higher temperature. It begins to run harder, with more force, producing more extreme outcomes at every end of the spectrum. This new intensity governs not only more powerful heat waves, but also more severe cold snaps when polar air surges southward, driven by increasingly dramatic temperature gradients. A warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture, leading to more intense rainfall, but it also accelerates evaporation between storms, creating more profound droughts. The consequence? When we observe the national weather map on any given day in a year like 2026, is a scene that looks increasingly like the one before us now. Not just a single extreme event, but several at once, in different regions and of different kinds, all competing for our attention and our capacity to respond. Climate scientists have a specific name for what this data reveals: compound events. These are periods when multiple, distinct regions are simultaneously struck by different forms of extreme weather. The research tracking these periods over the last few decades has yielded unambiguous conclusions. Their frequency is rising. The intensity of each individual event within these periods is also rising. And the geographic area affected the number of regions concurrently under some form of severe weather stress is expanding. The question that researchers are now grappling with is not whether this trend is real, but how quickly it is accelerating. Are we witnessing an exceptional outlier where 300 simultaneous weather alerts will eventually return to a lower, more normal number? Or is 300 becoming the new baseline, with the ceiling still climbing higher? While no one has a definitive answer, the data clearly supports a directional trend, and that trend is not pointing toward fewer simultaneous extreme events. The storm named Sinlaku sits at the absolute pinnacle of this particular snapshot in time. It is the most severe single event in a field of over 300, the one that has earned the classification of extreme, while all others cluster below it on the scale of severity. It represents the sharpest and most immediate danger in this pattern, but it is still just one part of that larger pattern. It does not exist in a vacuum. To think of it in another way, Sinlaku is the loudest voice in an already deafening room. The critical mistake would be to hear only that single voice and fail to recognize what the noise level of the entire room is telling us about the system as a whole. And this is where the abstract idea of a changing climate connects directly and powerfully to the 170,000 American citizens in Sinlaku's path. The infrastructure vulnerability that makes Guam's aging power grid so perilous is not a problem unique to the island. Its 50-year-old generators, its known capacity shortfalls, and a system that already collapsed under a previous storm named Mir are about to be tested even more severely. This same dynamic is playing out across the nation. We see it in Louisiana, where the grid has been repeatedly damaged by Gulf hurricanes and has yet to be rebuilt to a standard that can withstand the current threat. It is the same story in Puerto Rico, which is still years into a recovery from Hurricane Maria, a disaster that exposed infrastructure failures hauntingly similar to those Guam faces today. And it's the same in California, where extreme heat pushes an old grid to its operational edge, turning rolling blackouts from a sign of failure into a routine management tool. The problem of aging and inadequate infrastructure is a national one. Guam's version of this crisis is simply more acute, more isolated, and, for many, more invisible. The political invisibility of the Mariana Islands, a structural gap that allows a Category 5 typhoon bearing down on American soil to receive only a fraction of the national attention it would if it were aimed at the Gulf Coast, is also not an isolated phenomenon. It is a more extreme example of a dynamic that consistently leaves the most vulnerable communities under-resourced when disaster strikes. These are the communities that lack political influence, that exist outside of major media markets, and whose fate does not carry significant electoral consequences for the officials charged with their well-being. Across every region of the country, these communities consistently receive less support in preparation for disasters and less assistance in their aftermath. The Marianas are an extreme case, but the pattern is visible in a less dramatic form in rural communities throughout Appalachia, in low-income neighborhoods within major coastal cities, and among tribal nations, whose disaster response funding has historically fallen far short of their assessed risk. Sinlaku is not creating a new form of inequality. It is revealing a pre-existing one in the most stark and dramatic way imaginable. This is precisely why those 302 alerts are so central to this story. They are not the cause of Sinlaku, nor are they connected to it through any direct atmospheric process. Instead, they represent the full, overwhelming scope of a system that is demanding attention, resources, and response capacity all at once. At the very moment, 170,000 Americans are waiting for the apex event to make landfall. Every other alert on that map represents a community with its own urgent needs, its own crisis, and its own legitimate claim on the focus of a nation. This is a country being asked to respond to everything, everywhere, all at once, but with infrastructure, institutions, and budgets that were designed for a far calmer baseline. The rest of the country is spread across the other 299 alerts. Each one is real, each one is serious, and each one is pulling from the same finite pool of national bandwidth. And at the very top of that list, in a category nearly all its own, Sinlaku closes in on a population that has been asking for the nation's attention for years. The question is no longer whether the system is under stress. 302 active alerts have already answered that. The question now is who gets seen when everything is demanding to be seen at once. And right now, the honest answer to that question is arriving at 184 miles per hour. The ocean itself is changing, covering 71% of the Earth's surface. It is the planet's largest storage system, its most powerful heat engine, and the direct source of energy for every tropical cyclone that has ever formed. Beneath the swirling expanse of Super Typhoon Sinlaku, the ocean is revealing a truth that could reshape our understanding of this storm and every one that will follow. A single figure, fundamental to this story yet rarely making headlines, is 93%. This staggering number represents the share of all excess heat trapped by our climate system since the industrial age that has been absorbed not by the air, but by the world's oceans. We tend to focus on the atmosphere when discussing a warming planet, the record-breaking air temperatures and shifting weather patterns. But for more than a century, the ocean has served as the silent, massive repository for the vast majority of this energy. It has been storing it, circulating it through its depths, and now it is increasingly releasing that power back into the storms that form upon its surface. The events unfolding in the Western Pacific are no isolated phenomenon. They are a direct and powerful expression of this long, quiet accumulation of heat. To truly grasp the forces at play, it is essential to distinguish between two critical oceanic measurements that, while sounding similar, tell profoundly different stories about a storm's potential. The first, sea surface temperature, is precisely what its name implies, a measure of the heat in the very top layer of the ocean. This is the metric most often cited in storm coverage, as it represents the immediate environment where atmosphere and water meet. While important, it has a crucial limitation as a tool for predicting a storm's ultimate intensity. A warm surface can be deceptive. If that layer of warmth is shallow, a powerful storm can easily churn the waters, pulling cooler, less energetic water up from below. This process, known as upwelling, effectively dilutes the storm's fuel source, creating a natural break that can cause it to weaken. It is a self-limiting feedback loop that helps explain why many storms, even over seemingly warm seas, fail to reach their maximum theoretical power. The second measurement, ocean heat content, addresses this very limitation by offering a far more complete picture. It doesn't just tell us how warm the surface is, it reveals how deep that warmth extends down into the water column. This metric quantifies the total volume of thermal energy available in the upper ocean, giving us a true sense of the fuel reservoir a storm can draw upon. When this layer of warm water is exceptionally deep, a cyclone can churn the sea relentlessly, and yet the surface temperature will barely drop. Any cooler water mixed upward is immediately replaced by more warm water from the vast reserve below. In this scenario, the storm's energy supply is not a shallow puddle, but a deep, seemingly endless fuel tank. And in 2026, data from the Western Pacific reveals ocean heat content anomalies that are historically unprecedented for this time of year. The tank is not just full, it is overflowing. This reality aligns perfectly with a trend documented by decades of research. Studies tracking tropical cyclone behavior since 1977 have identified a clear and strengthening signal. The most powerful storms on our planet are now intensifying more rapidly than they did in the past. They are achieving higher peak wind speeds. Their destructive potential is spreading across a wider geographic range, and they are occurring over a longer seasonal window than historical baselines would ever predict. While there is natural variability in this data, with individual years fluctuating and single storms behaving unpredictably, the directional trend is unmistakable. To describe this pattern as merely emerging would be a profound understatement. It has already emerged. We are living within this new reality, watching it express itself at 184 miles per hour in the month of April, aimed directly at 170,000 American citizens who need the world to understand the forces now aimed at their shores. The timing of this storm, in April, is deeply significant and warrants closer examination. The Western Pacific typhoon season has a well-established historical rhythm, its activity reliably peaking between August and October. This is when sea surface temperatures typically reach their annual maximum and atmospheric conditions are most favorable for cyclone development. By all historical standards, April should be part of the quiet, early season. The ocean is supposed to be cooler, the atmosphere less conducive to storm formation. But Super Typhoon Sinlaku is clearly operating outside of these traditional rules. It is achieving Category 5 intensity in April for one simple reason. The ocean beneath it is no longer behaving as April oceans once did. The immense reservoir of heat stored in its depths is not waiting for a seasonal cue from the summer sun. It is simply there, available, and Sinlaku is drawing upon every joule of that energy. Yet, perhaps the most fascinating part of this story comes from a source one might never expect: the distant Tibetan Plateau. While it may seem unrelated, the connection is real, and its implications are profound. As the largest and highest elevated landmass on Earth, the Tibetan Plateau exerts an enormous influence on regional and even global climate. Changes occurring on its surface specifically, its temperature, and the extent of its snowpack can trigger cascading effects in atmospheric circulation patterns that reach far across Asia and into the Pacific Ocean. This immense plateau acts as an elevated heat source during the summer, powerfully influencing the flow of air across the continent. As the plateau warms and its snow and ice cover diminish, both of which are happening at a measurable and consistent rate, the temperature gradients that drive the upper-level winds over the Western Pacific are being altered. These circulation patterns directly shape the environment where typhoons form, particularly by affecting wind shear. Wind shear is a key atmospheric force that can limit a storm's growth. High shear acts to tear a developing cyclone apart, while low shear creates a calm, stable environment where a storm can organize and strengthen without resistance. The remarkably low shear conditions observed across the Western Pacific in recent decades, the very conditions allowing Sinlaku to intensify so freely, may be a direct downstream consequence of changes happening thousands of vast miles away on the roof of the world. This sequence presents a stark illustration of planetary interconnectedness. The warming of a high-altitude plateau in Central Asia contributes to a decline in atmospheric shear over the Pacific, which in turn allows a typhoon to grow into a Category 5 monster threatening islands in its path. It is a chain of physical consequences, a textbook example of a climate teleconnection that reminds us our planet behaves as one integrated system. When a fundamental change is introduced to one part of that system, the effects can manifest in places and in ways that are not immediately intuitive. Finally, layering on top of all this is the developing El Niño Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, situation throughout 2026. For decades, forecasters have used the historical patterns associated with El Niño years to produce seasonal outlooks for tropical cyclone activity. These events have been known to suppress storm formation in the Western Pacific, while enhancing it in the Central Pacific, or sometimes the reverse, depending on the specific character of the El Niño. The fundamental problem in 2026, however, is that these trusted historical relationships were all derived from a baseline ocean state that no longer exists. The average sea surface temperature during past El Niño events was significantly cooler than the baseline temperature of today's ocean. We are therefore entering uncharted waters, where old patterns may no longer hold, raising the critical question of just how reliable our past experience will be in a rapidly warming world. The dynamics of El Niño are currently unfolding over an ocean that is, by all historical measures, exceptionally warm. This presents a profound challenge for forecasting models, which must now operate in uncharted territory, extrapolating from data relationships that may no longer be reliable. While the fundamental physics of the atmosphere and ocean remain unchanged, the initial conditions are entirely new, and new starting points inevitably lead to different results. This raises an urgent question. What might this mean for the rest of 2026? Current models point toward a season of heightened storm activity and more rapid intensification. The very ocean fueling these systems is unlike any seen in our reliable records, suggesting the resulting typhoon season could be equally unprecedented. The storm known as Sinlaku, which has already undergone rapid intensification to Category 5 strength in April, is a case in point. Among forecasters, there is genuine concern that this event is not an outlier, but rather a chilling preview of what the peak months of the season may hold. Should these unusual ocean heat anomalies continue through the summer and into the peak typhoon window of August to October, the 2026 season in the Western Pacific will have the thermodynamic foundation to shatter intensity records that have been in place for decades. It is a sobering thought that Sinlaku may not even be the most powerful storm of the year. This current tempest, the strongest on Earth as it threatens 170,000 Americans with winds of 184 miles per hour, could simply be the opening act. The ocean contains a vast reservoir of energy, far more than has been released so far, and the atmospheric conditions conducive to converting that energy into destructive wind and surge show no signs of abating. The season has only just begun. The story of Sinlaku can unfold in two very different ways. In one version, this powerful early storm acts as a crucial wake-up call. It could force a necessary confrontation with infrastructure weaknesses, political neglect, and the growing disparity between the threats these islands face and the resources available to them. But there is another, darker possibility, that Sinlaku becomes just the first in a relentless series of disasters, each demanding attention until the collective ability to respond is completely exhausted. Which of these futures comes to pass is not determined by the storm itself. It is being decided now, in the quiet, often invisible discussions taking place in emergency operations centers, congressional offices, and federal budget meetings. The ocean merely holds the energy. It makes no decisions. How we react to its warnings is a choice that rests entirely with us. Meanwhile, another drama is unfolding, silent and unseen, some 36,000 kilometers above the planet's surface. It is the kind of event that goes unnoticed by most, until the critical systems orbiting at that altitude begin to fail at the worst possible time. For 9 straight days, satellite monitoring networks have detected abnormally high levels of electron flux in the near-Earth environment. This condition is a direct result of increased solar activity. The solar wind, a perpetual stream of charged particles from the sun, is interacting more intensely with Earth's magnetosphere, the natural magnetic shield that typically protects our world. But what happens when that shield is tested? Under typical conditions, the magnetosphere adeptly deflects the majority of these energetic particles, safeguarding the satellites that operate within the radiation belts. However, when the sun becomes more active and the solar wind grows stronger, the environment in near-Earth space turns hostile. Satellites begin to accumulate a subtle, slow-building, and potentially dangerous form of stress. The specific phenomenon is known as deep dielectric charging. And understanding it reveals one of the most counterintuitive risks in space weather. Instead of causing immediate external harm, high-energy electrons can pierce a satellite's outer shell. They then become embedded within the internal insulating materials, or dielectrics, that protect sensitive electronics. As more and more of these electrons become trapped over time, a significant static charge slowly builds up deep inside the spacecraft's structure. Once this accumulated charge reaches a critical threshold, it must release. This internal discharge can manifest in various ways, from corrupting stored data and interrupting normal functions to damaging sensitive electronics or causing permanent failure. Because the entire process occurs internally, invisible from the outside, the resulting malfunctions are notoriously hard to diagnose. A satellite might start behaving erratically, dropping data packets, sending corrupted images, or losing contact with no apparent cause. For the ground operators, it is like troubleshooting a ghost. This is not merely a theoretical concern. The 2010 incident with the Galaxy 15 satellite, which ceased responding to commands and drifted dangerously into other orbital paths, was partly blamed on space weather. Likewise, numerous GPS satellite anomalies over the years have been connected to these elevated particle environments. It is precisely because the effects are delayed, cumulative, and hidden from view that the risk of deep dielectric charging is treated with such gravity. But what does this silent threat in space have to do with the immediate crisis unfolding in the Western Pacific? Why is an event happening thousands of kilometers away relevant to a Category 5 typhoon aimed at American soil? The connection can be summarized in a single crucial word: dependency. The very systems being used to track Sinlaku, predict its path, and coordinate the emergency response for 170,000 people are not independent, ground-based operations. They are fundamentally and profoundly reliant on satellites, and these essential satellites are, at this very moment, flying through an environment where the electron flux has been dangerously elevated for 9 consecutive days. To understand the gravity of this situation, consider what the response to Sinlaku requires from this space-based infrastructure. A fleet of geostationary weather satellites, known as the GOES series, supplies the constant stream of visible and infrared imagery that is vital for meteorologists. They use this data to watch the storm's structure, follow the movement of its eye, evaluate its organization, and, most critically, spot the telltale signs of rapid intensification that shape the forecast from one hour to the next. Without the clear, real-time view provided by GOES, the forecasters at the Joint Typhoon Warning Center would be left to work partially blind. Without a continuous, high-resolution view from orbit, forecasters lose their most critical tool for understanding a typhoon's behavior. This overhead perspective is precisely what tells them if the eye wall is tightening, if a replacement cycle has begun, or if the storm is poised for a sudden leap in intensity. For emergency managers in Guam and the CNMI, the entire 3-6-hour countdown, they are working against hinges on that imagery being uninterrupted, precise, and accessible. Concurrently, signals from GPS satellites provide the exact positioning data needed to track the storm's center of circulation. This allows forecasters to distinguish between a path that sends the eye wall directly over Saipan and one that keeps it 50 miles to the north. In a storm of this magnitude, that distinction represents the difference between catastrophic destruction and severe but survivable damage for tens of thousands of people. In this context, positional accuracy is not a technical luxury. It is a fundamental pillar of public safety. Yet the GPS constellation itself, despite spanning multiple orbital shells with dozens of satellites, is not entirely immune to the effects of space weather, as individual satellites have shown degraded performance during past particle events. Beyond positioning, another layer of orbital infrastructure is equally critical: communication satellites. These relays are the conduits for data streams connecting reconnaissance aircraft flying through Sinu's core back to analysis centers on the ground. They carry the essential emergency communications that enable local officials in Guam and the CNMI to coordinate with FEMA, the military, and relief organizations that are prepositioning resources. They also support the warning systems that push alerts out to the public. When a population has limited time to prepare and few options for evacuation, the communication infrastructure that delivers warnings and coordinates the response is not merely background support. It becomes the very nervous system of the entire emergency management operation. All these vital systems, the weather imagers, the positioning satellites, and the communication relays, are currently operating within a space environment that has been more energetic than its baseline for 9 consecutive days. This raises a crucial question. What does this increased activity actually mean for the systems we depend on? It is important to be precise here, for Calm Space is committed to clarity over alarm for its own sake. A 9-day event of elevated electron flux is certainly noteworthy. It is the sort of occurrence that prompts satellite operators to run additional diagnostics, monitor their anomaly logs with greater care, and in some cases, even adjust a satellite's orientation or operational mode to reduce its exposure. However, based on current measurements, this is not the kind of extreme space weather event that has historically produced widespread satellite failures. The major disruptions recorded in satellite history have generally been linked to far more intense phenomena. These include powerful solar flares, major geomagnetic storms, and the impact of coronal mass ejections that dramatically compress the magnetosphere. Such events can flood the radiation belts with particles at levels that far exceed what is produced by 9 days of elevated flux. This context is essential for properly understanding the current level of risk. Fortunately, the redundancy built into the systems supporting the response to Typhoon Sinu is substantial. GOES is not a single satellite, and the GPS constellation is designed with significant overlap. Communication relay capacity is distributed across many assets, and both the National Weather Service and the Joint Typhoon Warning Center have backup data pathways. Because of these safeguards, the probability that current space weather will compromise the forecast for Sinu in any meaningful way is considered low. That assessment is an honest one, and it is important to state it clearly. But a low probability is not the same as a zero probability. The more significant point here is not about a single satellite anomaly that might or might not happen in the next 36 hours. Rather, it concerns the layering of stresses on systems that are already being asked to perform at the very limits of their operational design. The meteorologists tracking Sinu are working with forecast models that are being pushed beyond their historical training data by ocean temperatures and atmospheric conditions that have no direct analog in the record. The emergency managers coordinating the response are racing against a timeline set by a storm that may still be intensifying. The infrastructure on the ground in Guam and the CNMI is already compromised from previous events, and now, the space-based systems that form the foundation of the entire monitoring and warning apparatus are operating in an electromagnetic environment that is more demanding than usual. Viewed individually, each of these stresses appears manageable. The forecasters are experienced, and their models are good. The emergency managers are prepared, and their coordination is functioning. The satellites are robust, and the redundancy is real. Even the aging power grid has backup systems. None of these individual pressure points represents a failure waiting to happen. However, systems under multiple, simultaneous stresses behave differently than systems under a single stress. The interactions between different failure modes, the way one degraded system can increase the load on adjacent ones, are where surprises often originate. And when the population depending on all these systems to perform correctly, numbers 170,000 American citizens, with nowhere to evacuate. The margin for surprise is uncomfortably thin. For 9 days, the sun has been quietly making the environment above us more challenging. For that same period, the storm has been making the environment below us more dangerous. The people caught between these two realities are now waiting, preparing, and hoping that every layer of the system watching out for them holds together for 36 more hours. In the grand scheme of space weather events, this is a footnote. But, in the context of what is happening right now in the Western Pacific, it is one more reminder that the infrastructure, keeping those 170,000 people connected to the rest of the country, is thinner and more critically dependent on systems operating correctly under stress than most of us ever have reason to consider. In the same time window that Sinew was achieving Category 5 intensity in the Western Pacific, two rocks were making their closest approaches to Earth from the opposite direction entirely. Two near-Earth asteroids, tracked by planetary defense monitoring networks, passed our planet at sublunar distances, meaning they flew by closer than the Moon. Both of these objects were small, and both were on trajectories that posed absolutely no impact threat to Earth. The scientific community had been aware of both asteroids well in advance. They were tracked through standard planetary defense protocols, their orbital calculations were run, and their safe passage margins were confirmed. Then, the experts simply moved on. It was a situation with no emergency and no drama, simply a quiet testament to the diligence of our planetary watch. Two ancient remnants of our solar system glide past our world, following orbits they have traced for millions upon millions of years. They are brief visitors to our planetary neighborhood, destined to swing by and then recede once more into the quiet dark. We speak of them not because they pose a threat, nor because they are tied to us by any physical force, but because their passage helps complete a picture that has been assembling itself, piece by piece, over this particular week. It is a picture worth observing in its entirety before we attempt to interpret its meaning. Let us step back and take inventory of the events unfolding concurrently in the days around Super Typhoon Slaku's intensification to a Category 5 storm. Here we have a typhoon that achieved the most powerful wind speeds of any storm on the planet in 2026. Arriving in April, a month when historical conditions would not typically support such development, and bearing down on 170,000 American citizens on remote Pacific islands. At the same time, a magnitude 5 earthquake rumbled deep beneath the northern CNMI, the very region in the storm's path, generated by one of Earth's most active subduction zones. For 9 straight days, heightened solar activity produced an elevated electron flux in near-Earth space, placing stress on the satellite infrastructure that underpins the entire apparatus for monitoring and providing warning against Slaku. Across the United States and its territories, 302 separate active weather alerts were in effect, from wildfires to floods to blizzards, all within the same week. And now, 2 near-Earth asteroids make their own sublunar passes within this same window. Each of these events is real and documented, yet none are causally linked to one another. But what are we to make of such a convergence? A list of events like this tends to evoke a particular response deep within the human psyche, one that risk communication experts know all too well. When faced with a cluster of strange or menacing occurrences, our minds instinctively search for a single connecting thread. This impulse is not some defect in our reasoning. It is in fact an essential and fundamental feature of our cognition. Pattern recognition is one of the primary cognitive tools that enabled our ancestors to survive. In a world of subtle signals, correctly identifying meaningful clusters, the rustle of leaves that betrayed a predator, the atmospheric signs that heralded a coming storm could mean the difference between life and death. It is a cognitive inheritance. The brain that perceives a pattern and chooses to investigate it is, in most settings, more adaptive than one that sees every event as a completely isolated incident. The challenge, however, arises when this same powerful instinct is applied to events that are genuinely and purely coincidental. It can lead us to conclusions that feel profoundly meaningful, but are entirely unsupported by the underlying reality. This is the story our minds instinctively write. The notion that two asteroids would sweep past Earth during the very same week as a historic typhoon feels significant, as if it must hold some deeper meaning. The earthquake occurring directly beneath the typhoon's target area feels as though it must be connected to the immense storm raging above. The elevated solar activity seems like it should be part of the very same system that gave rise to the cyclone. Our brain, a natural storyteller, gathers these disparate pieces and skillfully weaves them into a coherent narrative. It is what brains are designed to do. They find the story within the data, regardless of whether a story truly exists there at all. Yet, when we turn to the plain language of science, the answer is entirely unequivocal. These events are not connected. The two asteroids are simply following orbital paths determined by gravitational dynamics that have been at work for millions of years, entirely indifferent to the state of the Pacific Ocean this week. Their close approaches to Earth were predicted many months ago, precisely because orbital mechanics is one of the most well-understood fields of physics. The earthquake was the result of immense tectonic forces that have been accumulating along the Mariana subduction zone over timescales that dwarf all of human civilization. The solar activity driving the electron flux is governed by the Sun's own roughly one-year cycle, which has operated on its own schedule long before the first tropical cyclone ever formed. And Slaku itself is a product of anomalously warm Pacific waters, low wind shear, and favorable atmospheric conditions, dynamics that have no direct relationship to subduction zones, asteroid orbits, or solar cycles, except in the broadest sense that they all share the same physical universe. None of these phenomena caused any of the others. An asteroid flyby does not intensify a typhoon, a deep earthquake does not steer a tropical cyclone, and solar activity does not warm the oceans on the timescale of a single storm season. The clustering of these events is a temporal coincidence, and it is important to remember that such coincidences happen all the time. We simply pay more attention when the individual events are themselves significant, because that significance amplifies our innate pattern-seeking response. And still, there is a lingering reluctance to dismiss this convergence entirely. This is not because of a hidden causal link, but because the act of observing them all at once offers a unique and valuable shift in perspective. It encourages you to pull back from the narrow focus on any single event and instead sit for a moment within the full, expansive context of everything happening simultaneously. It allows you to see the planet doing multiple things at once, and the solar system doing multiple things at once. Each system operates on its own unique timeline, governed by its own physics, proceeding without any regard for human convenience or our limited spans of attention. If one of those asteroids had passed during a quiet week, with no major storms or elevated space weather, it would have been little more than a minor note in a planetary defense report. But seeing it now, alongside everything else, forces a wider view. There is a profound clarity to be found in this wider view if you allow yourself to see it. This week, the universe is not conspiring against us. It is not dispatching a message or building towards some grand crescendo. It is simply operating as it always has, producing events across every conceivable scale, from the geological to the astronomical. The vast, overwhelming majority of these events go unobserved, unrecorded, and unnoticed by a single human being. This particular week, however, several of these independent events happen to be unfolding in a window that overlaps with something of genuine consequence, a crisis with real impacts for real people, one that rightly deserves our full and undivided attention and a dedicated response. The indifference of the universe does not make the danger any less real. In some ways, it makes the situation even more clear. Therein lies the true lesson. There is no grand architecture to uncover here. No unified theory that connects the asteroids to the earthquake, the space weather to the storm. There is only the quiet, steady, and indifferent work of physics, and the human imperative to respond to the dangers that arise. In the grand tapestry of the universe, there is only physics, expressing itself on different scales. Some of these outcomes are cosmic and distant, the harmless passage of an asteroid, a remote earthquake, a solar flare. But other outcomes are profoundly immediate, currently threatening the lives of 170,000 people on a chain of islands in the Pacific. And this is the central truth of the moment. The temptation to get lost in the texture of surrounding coincidences, to focus on the asteroids and seismic activity, is itself a version of the very problem that has left these islands underprepared and underprotected for decades. It is the habit of looking at interesting peripheral details instead of the core issue that demands our action. Right now, there is only a powerful storm pointed at a very vulnerable place, and a nation that has not been paying nearly enough attention. While the asteroids passed safely, and the earthquake triggered no tsunami, these are minor resolutions. The fundamental question remains unanswered. Will 170,000 Americans receive the infrastructure support, the political attention, and the national resources they desperately need in the days and weeks after Sinlaku passes? This outcome has nothing to do with orbital mechanics or tectonic plates. It has everything to do with choices, and unlike the trajectories of asteroids, those choices are not yet determined. This situation brings us to a deeply unsettling question. Why does almost no one seem to know this is happening? Imagine for a moment that a hurricane of Category 5 strength were bearing down on Tampa, Florida. You would not be discovering this from a quiet space like Calm Space. The information would be inescapable. Every major television network would have already cut to continuous, live coverage. The crawler at the bottom of every news screen in the country would be running the storm track in real time, a constant reminder of the approaching danger. Social media feeds would be saturated with evacuation orders, maps of shelter locations, and constant updates from meteorologists. The entire American media ecosystem would generate that particular flavor of collective anxiety, reserved for when a major storm threatens a major mainland city. The president would be on camera, the FEMA administrator would be at a podium, and governors would be declaring emergencies on live television. The national conversation would collapse to a single, urgent point, the way it always does when the geography of a threat is somewhere the country has decided it recognizes as real. The storm Sinlaku is, by objective measures, stronger than any hurricane that has ever made landfall on the continental United States. Its winds have been clocked at 184 miles per hour. In response, the National Weather Service has issued one of only 2 extreme severity alerts currently active across its entire nationwide system. 170,000 American citizens are in the direct impact zone. The storm is real. The threat is documented. The severity classification is essentially without precedent in the alert data, and yet the coverage it receives is a fraction, a small fraction of what a storm of equivalent or even lesser power would generate if it were aimed at a mainland coastal city. The question of why this is true is not a comfortable one, but it is an important one. The exploration begins in the realm of psychology, which is foundational to everything else. For decades, research in cognitive psychology has documented concepts like psychic numbing and the identifiable victim effect. But the mechanism most relevant here is the powerful and consistent effect of geographic or psychological distance. This is not speculation. It has been measured, replicated, and documented across multiple research traditions. An event happening close to you registers with far greater urgency than an identical event happening far away. Even when the objective stakes the number of people affected, the severity of the harm are equivalent or even higher for the distant event. The brain, it seems, applies a distance discount. This discounting process is automatic, largely unconscious, and extremely difficult to override through purely rational argument. Guam is 3,800 miles from Los Angeles. That immense distance is processed by the brain not merely as a geographic fact, but as a relevant signal about importance. Far away means less immediate. Less immediate means a lower alarm response, and a lower alarm response means less media coverage is demanded, less political pressure is generated, and less collective urgency is mobilized. This is not a character flaw in the American public. It is a feature of human cognition that evolved in environments where geographic distance was a reliable proxy for personal relevance. The profound problem is that our cognitive wiring was not designed for a world where citizenship, infrastructure responsibility, and moral obligation extend across 3,800 miles of ocean to islands that most people have never visited and cannot locate on a map without help. The political structure governing American territories takes that cognitive distance and institutionalizes it, locking it into place. The residents of Guam and the CNMI are American citizens. They are subject to federal law. They serve in the United States military at per capita rates that exceed most states and have done so across every major conflict of the past century. They contribute to and depend on federal systems, and yet they cannot vote for president. They send non-voting delegates to the House of Representatives. They have no senators. They do not appear in the electoral vote calculations that determine which states receive political attention, which governors get phone calls from the White House before a disaster, and which communities get prepositioned federal resources when a storm is coming. Think about what that means in practice for disaster response. When a hurricane threatens Florida, the political incentive structure for the federal government to respond visibly, promptly, and generously is itself a storm. Florida has 29 electoral votes. It has 2 senators who sit on committees with jurisdiction over FEMA funding and disaster relief appropriations. It has a congressional delegation that will be on camera within hours, demanding federal action and holding officials accountable for any perceived inadequacy of response. The political cost of getting it wrong in Florida is immediate, measurable, and career-affecting. The same cannot be said for a territory without a voice or a vote. When disaster strikes Guam, the political fallout from an inadequate response is shouldered almost entirely by the island's residents, who possess no formal way to hold responsible federal officials accountable through voting. The outcome is not a system born of malicious neglect, but one defined by systematic and structural inattention. Over the course of years and decades, this persistent inattention accumulates, revealing itself in the infrastructure deficits, preparedness shortfalls, and delayed emergency responses that now define the relationship between the Mariana Islands and federal disaster management. This situation poses a fundamental question about the functionality of systems in which essential feedback mechanisms have been severed. A similar structural logic governs the media market, propelled by economic rationales that, while understandable, produce ethically troubling outcomes. Within a media landscape funded by advertising, the allocation of coverage is primarily determined by audience engagement, a metric closely linked to viewers' personal connection to a story. A hurricane approaching Tampa, for example, instantly engages an audience of millions who have family in the region, have vacationed there, or follow Tampa's local news via national cable. This built-in audience has a personal investment in the event's outcome, making them dedicated consumers of the coverage and thereby boosting ratings. Higher ratings lead to increased advertising revenue, which in turn dictates the level of resources a network will dedicate to the story. In contrast, a typhoon menacing Guam connects with a much smaller audience possessing that same direct personal tie. While the story's significance is no less profound, and the editorial justification for covering it is equally valid on its own merits, the economic argument for sustained coverage is significantly weaker in an advertising-driven environment. This is not the result of a conspiracy of silence, but is simply a market outcome. When such market forces are allowed to control the dissemination of life-saving information in a democracy, the consequences can prove to be lethal. Puerto Rico witnessed this dynamic firsthand in 2017 with Hurricane Maria. Immediately following the storm, media coverage was extensive, driven by powerful imagery, absolute destruction, and compelling human interest stories. However, the type of sustained, consistent, accountability-driven journalism needed to keep national pressure on the federal recovery effort dissipated far more quickly than it would have for a similar disaster on the US mainland. As a direct result, the recovery process was slower, less adequately funded, and more chaotic than any objective assessment of the situation would have justified. The identical political and media dynamics that accounted for the disparity in coverage also explained the parallel disparity in the official response. For the residents of the Marianas, watching this tragedy unfold was like seeing a familiar pattern, as they had experienced quieter iterations of it following every major typhoon in their own recent history. The ethical question at the heart of this entire situation is deeply uncomfortable to confront, as it compels us to ask whether we genuinely treat all American citizens as equally American. The infrastructure gap, made visible by 50-year-old generators and a power grid that fails under storms less powerful than Sinlaku, is the material consequence of decades of federal investment choices that did not prioritize Guam's energy security to the same degree as comparable mainland infrastructure. The political gap is a reflection of a democratic system built for states, a framework that has yet to adequately resolve what equal citizenship entails for the nation's territories. Finally, the coverage gap stems from market structures and cognitive biases that methodically reduce the perceived urgency of events simply because of their geographic remoteness from the mainland. Each of these three disparities converges on the same unsettling conclusion. All three of these gaps are poised to become starkly visible in the response to Typhoon Sinlaku. The 170,000 Americans in the storm's path will experience the effects with painful directness, even as most of the mainland remains largely unaware. In practice, the answer to the question of whether we treat all American citizens as equals has, far too often, been a resounding no. This is not an answer declared loudly or with malice, but one that is delivered structurally and consistently, with consequences that are on the verge of becoming devastatingly concrete for a large population. While their citizenship has never been debatable, their visibility to the rest of the nation has always been conditional. The storm itself, of course, is oblivious to these human constructs. It remains indifferent to the political architecture of US territories, the economic models of cable news, and the cognitive biases of the human mind. It is purely energy in motion, now a mere 36 hours from landfall. We, however, are not indifferent, or at the very least, we have a responsibility not to be. The profound gap between the response this crisis warrants and the media coverage it is actually receiving is, in itself, a crucial story that deserves to be told, for its underlying truth will persist long after the storm's winds have passed. In considering the 2026 Western Pacific typhoon season, it is vital to recognize that the season is not over. In fact, it has barely begun. The reality that its very first major test has produced the most powerful storm on the entire planet ought to be setting off alarms in many more places than it currently is. This particular storm, Sinlaku, did not materialize from nothing. It was born out of a very specific set of environmental factors, a combination of immense ocean heat, highly favorable atmospheric dynamics, and seasonal conditions that converged to permit a Category 5 super typhoon to form in April, a month when historical data indicates a storm of such intensity should be virtually impossible. This reality leads to an unsettling follow-on question. The existence of the potent, storm-fueling conditions is not in doubt. The evidence for them is clear. The truly critical question is whether these conditions are likely to dissipate. According to all available data, the answer is a definitive no. The exceptionally warm Pacific waters that fueled Sinlaku's explosive growth are not a short-term anomaly that will simply vanish before August. Likewise, the environment of reduced wind shear, which enabled the storm to organize itself with almost no atmospheric hindrance, was not some transient, week-long weather pattern. The vast ocean heat content that served as a deep and sustained reservoir of fuel for Sinlaku is the product of years of thermal accumulation, a process that cannot just disappear on a seasonal timescale. These are not temporary conditions, they are structural characteristics of the present climate state in the Western Pacific. Furthermore, they will still be in place and will likely be even more pronounced when the typhoon season arrives at its statistical peak in the coming months. Adding another layer of complexity to this situation, El Niño conditions are becoming more established as 2026 unfolds, introducing a variable that forecasters are grappling with under genuine uncertainty. The historical relationship between El Niño and typhoon activity in the Western Pacific is neither simple nor uniform. Different El Niño events are known to yield widely divergent outcomes based on their strength, their particular structure, and the baseline climate state they interact with. All of this combines to create a profound sense of unpredictability for the remainder of the season. In past El Niño years, the intricate dance between ocean and atmosphere has yielded varied outcomes, sometimes leading to fewer typhoons in specific Western Pacific corridors, while storm activity surged elsewhere, and at other times showing a negligible suppressing effect as powerful storms still formed. For decades, the forecasting community has relied on these historical patterns, building seasonal models calibrated against the vast observational record. These models produce the probabilistic guidance that is indispensable for emergency managers and infrastructure planners. However, the year 2026 presents a profound challenge, one that calls into question the very foundation of this entire approach. The models were all trained on a historical baseline that no longer reflects our planet's current state. The average ocean temperatures during previous El Niño events were simply cooler than the starting point for the ocean today. This effectively means that the models are being required to extrapolate into a future without any direct historical precedent, applying relationships that were established under environmental conditions that have since fundamentally changed. Forecasters are not navigating completely in the dark. The laws of physics remain constant, and the models are remarkably sophisticated. And yet, the confidence intervals surrounding their predictions are consequently wider than they would be in a more familiar climate, and the potential for unsettling surprises at the extreme upper end of the storm intensity scale is undeniably greater. In concrete terms, what does this heightened uncertainty signify for the 170,000 American citizens residing in the Marianas who are about to emerge from Typhoon Sinlaku only to face a recovery process expected to span many months? It means that two critical clocks, the clock for recovery and the clock for the storm season, are now running concurrently. There is a serious and tangible risk that these two timelines will collide. Rebuilding critical infrastructure on an isolated island group after a major typhoon is not a swift process. For instance, following Typhoon Yutu in 2018, restoring reliable power to some communities in the CNMI took the better part of a year. A similar situation unfolded after Typhoon Mawar struck Guam in 2023, where the restoration of full services became a months-long endeavor. These extended timelines are not a reflection of inadequate effort or a lack of will. They are an unavoidable consequence of geographic reality. Every single repair crew, every piece of heavy equipment, every meter of cable, and every replacement generator must be transported across thousands of miles of open ocean, often through ports that may have sustained damage themselves. This represents a logistical supply chain that simply cannot be compressed, regardless of how desperate the need on the ground may become. Should Sinlaku inflict the kind of widespread infrastructure damage that its current intensity and trajectory indicate is probable, the recovery timeline would begin in May and extend deep into the latter half of the year. This timeline runs perilously close to the next period of maximum danger, as the peak of the 2026 typhoon season typically arrives in August and September. The available window between the conclusion of Sinlaku's recovery efforts and the start of the next high-risk period is, therefore, anything but generous. A community with a partially restored power grid, a communications network that has been patched together but not fully rebuilt, and ports that are operational but not at full capacity, is not a community that is truly prepared for the next major storm. It is, in reality, a compromised baseline, confronting a typhoon season that remains active and is entirely capable of producing another storm of the same magnitude that Sinlaku has already shown is possible. The policy failures that have culminated in this precarious situation are not concealed in classified documents or obscured by technical jargon. They are, in fact, laid bare in plain sight. These failures are documented in federal audit reports, within planning documents from the Guam Power Authority, and in the official assessments filed by FEMA evaluators following previous storms. They can be found in the testimony of local officials before congressional committees, the very bodies with jurisdiction over the funding that could have addressed the documented vulnerabilities. The fragility of Guam's aging power grid has been formally known, documented, and officially acknowledged for years. Likewise, the urgent need for infrastructure investment in the CNMI has been communicated through every appropriate channel by local leaders who understood precisely what they were asking for and why it was so critical. The path leading to this moment of crisis is therefore not a mystery. It is a clearly and well-documented trail of consistently ignored warnings. The engineering assessments have already been performed. The necessary resilience standards have been clearly defined. The required investments have been priced out. The official recommendations have been written and submitted. What has been consistently and conspicuously absent is the sustained political will required to act upon these recommendations. The reason for this insufficiency of political will circles back to the same structural reality that explains so many other gaps this story reveals. The very people who would directly benefit from a modernized power grid in Guam and critical infrastructure investment in the CNMI are American citizens who lack the ability to vote for the federal officials controlling the budgets that would fund such projects. Their unmet needs do not create the electoral consequences that typically translate into political urgency in Washington. It is a poignant irony that they send their sons and daughters to serve in the American military at per capita rates that would be widely celebrated and reciprocated with substantial investment if those service members came from any state in the Union. And yet, they face the strongest storm of the year with power generation equipment that is, in many cases, older than most of the residents it is meant to serve. So, is the situation actually improving? The most honest answer to that question is complex. Yes, there has been progress in some dimensions, but in the dimensions that matter most for what is about to unfold, that progress is not nearly sufficient. Emergency management capacity in both Guam and the CNMI has grown significantly since the hard lessons learned from Typhoon U2 in 2018. Communication systems have seen upgrades in some areas, shelter capacity has been expanded, and the formal coordination between local agencies and FEMA has been refined and genuinely improved in practice, not just on paper. These represent real and meaningful improvements, achieved through considerable hard work, and they will undoubtedly help save lives in the coming hours and days. But these enhancements sit atop a foundation that has not been fundamentally repaired. The situation is analogous to placing a stronger roof on a house whose foundational walls are still deeply cracked from the previous storm. The aging grid, the isolation of the supply chain, and the limited redundancy in systems that power water distribution, medical services, and communications remain largely unresolved. When Typhoon Sinlaku makes landfall, these improvements will certainly matter, but the deep, unresolved vulnerabilities will likely matter a great deal more. Ultimately, the fundamental question of readiness for what is coming is not, at its core, a technical one. Every technical question about what must be done to secure these islands has already been answered. The engineering assessments exist. The resilience standards are defined. The investment requirements are known. The existing gap is not a result of a lack of knowledge or a failure of expertise. The gap that leaves this particular American community so dangerously exposed is, and has been, a persistent and profound failure of political will. At the heart of this approaching storm lies a profound political question, one that has been asked for decades without a satisfactory answer. It is a question of whether American citizens residing on Pacific Islands are entitled to the same fundamental security in their infrastructure, the same baseline of disaster readiness that their fellow citizens along the Gulf Coast take for granted. This principle should be self-evident, not a point of contention requiring endless debate. It ought to be an accepted truth, woven into the fabric of policy, funding, and decisive action, rather than a recurring plea found in federal reports and post-disaster analyses. A single typhoon, like Sinlaku, cannot resolve such a deep-seated political issue. No storm ever does. But what it can do is make that question impossible to ignore, forcing a moment of clarity. And it is in these moments, when deferral is no longer an option, that real change sometimes begins. With the typhoon season just starting and atmospheric conditions showing no signs of improving, the window to address this as a distant problem for a future budget is closing at a speed of 184 miles per hour. The final countdown is now underway. In these hours, a colossal storm system named Sinlaku is churning across the western Pacific, advancing at 15 kilometers per hour. Its sustained winds have reached an astonishing 184 miles per hour, and its central pressure continues to fall, signaling further intensification. Its path is set directly toward an archipelago of American islands, where the population is engaged in a grimly familiar ritual, preparing for a storm when there is nowhere to run. They are securing what can be saved, finding the deepest possible shelter, and simply waiting for the inevitable to arrive. This is the reality for 170,000 people, a number that must be seen not as a mere statistic in a weather report, but as a vast collection of individual lives. Within that number are 170,000 personal stories unfolding. There are families in concrete houses, veterans of past typhoons who know the terrifying sound the wind makes just before it shatters windows. There are children huddled in school shelters, feeling a fear that no amount of preparation can ever truly erase. There are hospital staff who will remain at their posts, steadfast through the entire passage of the eye wall, because their patients cannot be moved, and so they, too, must stay. And there are elderly residents, for whom limited mobility and resources transform every major storm into an even more perilous ordeal. These are American citizens, living in an American territory, and under the American flag, yet they are confronting a crisis in a place most of their compatriots on the mainland could not even name. The very infrastructure supporting them is fragile, and it is about to face its most extreme test. The electrical grid that serves these islands, the very same system that collapsed during Typhoon Ponga and failed once more during Typhoon Mawar, is now in the path of a storm that could surpass both in its peak intensity and its devastating duration. This creates a cascade of potential failures. The backup generators that are critical for hospitals and clinics run on a finite supply of fuel. The water pumping stations, entirely dependent on electricity, will cease to function when the grid goes dark, and the roads, the essential arteries for emergency vehicles to reach those in distress, will quickly become impassable, choked with debris long before the eye wall has even fully passed. It is a stark reminder of how modern life hangs by the thinnest of threads. Uncertainty looms over the final hours of the forecast. While meteorological models are converging on an alarming scenario, even at the lower end of projections, there remains a window of possibility. Within the next 24 hours, Sinlaku could behave in ways that were not fully anticipated. It could deepen more rapidly than predicted. Its track could shift just enough to place the eye wall directly over a more densely populated center, or it could arrive with a storm surge that overwhelms the already extreme forecasts. In the context of this storm and this vulnerable environment, uncertainty offers no comfort. Instead, it points in only one direction, toward the potential for an even greater, more widespread catastrophe. What happens in the aftermath will be determined almost entirely by decisions and conditions that are being set right now, before the first winds arrive. The ultimate human cost will hinge on a series of critical variables. How many people have found refuge in well-built shelters compared to those in more marginal structures? How much fuel is available for hospital generators? What reserves of food and water have families managed to store? And after the storm, how quickly can the main port be cleared and the airport reopened? Perhaps most critically, how rapidly can federal assistance be mobilized and transported across 3,800 miles of ocean to a community that is utterly unable to resupply itself? These are the questions that will decide whether the death toll is 3 or 30 or 300. They separate a recoverable disaster from a wound that will scar a generation. These problems are being tackled at this very moment by local emergency managers, federal officials, and military personnel, all working with the resources available to them under difficult constraints that were established long before this storm ever formed. Such is the nature of a fast-moving disaster that by the time its story becomes widely known, the event itself may already be over. Mainstream attention typically arrives in the aftermath. Once the dramatic images are available, the damage can be quantified, and the narrative is simple enough to be packaged for a brief news segment. The crucial 3-6 hour window beforehand, the period when information, resources, and focused attention might have actually altered the outcome, slips by in near total silence. It is a silence noticed only by the meteorologists studying the models, the emergency managers making urgent calls, and the 170,000 Americans who are listening as the wind begins to howl outside their windows. This is not a new phenomenon, it is a familiar and tragic pattern. It has played out after every major typhoon to strike the Mariana Islands in living memory. A storm arrives, immense damage is inflicted, and the long, arduous recovery grinds forward, largely outside the national spotlight. Eventually, the next storm gathers on the horizon, and the same conversation begins anew, filled with the same familiar phrases. The invisible disaster, the forgotten Americans. The most dangerous address under the nation's flag. This recurring cycle raises a painful question. Must history always repeat itself? The storm itself is indifferent to all of this. It possesses no political consciousness, no awareness of the disparities it so brutally exposes. It is simply energy, organized by the laws of physics, moving across warm ocean waters toward land. But we are not an indifferent force of nature. We possess politics, we possess awareness, And we possess the unique capacity to look at what is unfolding right now, 36 hours out, and make a conscious choice. We can decide whether this time, with this storm and this strike on this population, will finally be the event that closes the gap between the values the United States professes and the actions it actually takes. 170,000 Americans are about to find out if their country is watching.